I took the liberty of changing the title of the talk today, and the series from ecosystems plural to ecosystem. And I'll talk a little bit about why I did that and why kind of my experience has really informed this kind of worldview and understanding of what an ecosystem is. But I think maybe it's important to ask each one of you, as you're all sitting in the audience today, when you saw that topic on the Meetup page or from the CodeBase email, what were you thinking about? What were some of the things that came to your mind when you were considering what an ecosystem is or what ecosystems are? Because I think this is a word and that is used a lot in the entrepreneurship community. It's used a lot in the startup community. And each of us has a different interpretation of what that entails. And especially from the academic side, it's been a course of study for a number of years, and there's a lot of contentious debates about what's included in that. So I think when we consider ecosystems and we consider this topic, it's really important to consider our perspective and how we're approaching it. And for me, I'll just tell you a little bit about my background. As you can probably tell by my accent, I'm not from here, but I've lived in Scotland for about a year and a half. But I just announced that I am the new Chief Community Officer of Startup Boost, which is a global pre-accelerator program for early stage startups. It's based in Los Angeles. That's where I'm from. But I get the opportunity of working remotely from here. But before that, I was working as the research director at tech.eu. I'm a trained data scientist, and my master's degrees were in quantitative social sciences. So I come from a data background and really trying to understand what ecosystems are from that perspective. I also have over 12 years working with government in different capacities, from the state and local government, city level, to the supranational level. I work with the European Commission quite a lot on their SME and innovation policy. I get the chance of going to Brussels on the 640 Brussels Airlines flight from here all the time, which is great because it is wonderful to hear kind of from their perspective what they consider an ecosystem to be, and also to kind of influence them a little bit of what some of the things they should be thinking about. So I've been working with entrepreneurs for a long time, and really kind of sitting at the kind of crux between academic and government and the business community, and with early stage founders for a number of years now. And I've had the chance to travel a lot, lived and worked in startup communities all around the globe, over almost 30 different startup communities. Worked with founders on every continent except Antarctica, but in the last couple of years been traveling, spending lots of time away from home to really understand what the pain points are for founders as they're getting started on their journeys. And as I mentioned previously, I come from a data background. So why am I doing all of this kind of travel and really putting myself in the position of these early stage founders in these different communities? Why are some of the reasons that I'm doing that? And it's because I realized from the perspective that I and looking at the startup community, I'm a sociologist, and looking really at the social practice of what entrepreneurship is. And it's a little bit different from how a lot of people in academia study entrepreneurship, coming from an economic perspective, looking at business development from a business school, trying to understand viability of different communities. But I really want to understand these social bonds and the social actions of entrepreneurship. So understanding events like this, why we take the time off in the evening to all come together to talk about topics like this, why is this important? What are the different practices that we do as people in an entrepreneurship community that help to build trust? And the only way to really understand that at a very granular level is to be there. And I've had the chance to do that, as I mentioned previously, in a lot of different places and spaces. And what you find, and what everyone always asks me is, what are some of the biggest differences you find between these different communities that you've lived and worked in? I spent a lot of time in Berlin, San Francisco, Tallinn, Estonia, Athens, Greece, some of the most, Minsk, Belarus, some of the most kind of not dissimilar places you can imagine. And what you really find is entrepreneurs and early stage founders in each of these different places have more in common than they have different. In terms of how the different types of practices and actions they're doing, how they're working together in these kind of 4 different categories. So how they're doing these things in each of these different places actually is quite durable. But where it's different is how well those communities that they're embedded in are part of this global ecosystem that I'll have a chance to talk about. So even though we're doing all of the same sorts of actions, we don't necessarily have the same opportunities based on where we are. So how can we find ways of ensuring that those experiences and what these founders are working on, how can we make that a more even playing field? And that's what I've really been kind of committing myself to working on for the last couple years, and really understanding what the challenges are and how we can kind of take some of those away. So first, what is an ecosystem? Kind of going back to that main question that we talked about, thinking in your mind, what are some of the kind of institutions and organizations and some of the things that you're thinking of that an ecosystem is comprised of? And kind of going back to that point, it depends on who you ask. So it means that everyone's perspective of what this is a valid one. So coming from the creative industries, for example, their perspective of what an ecosystem looks like might be very different from someone that's coming from an economic perspective, or coming from the government side that has a very specific and rigid view of what an ecosystem is something that is geographically contained within a certain region, city, or country. So understanding where we are contextually, this is really important kind of going forward to think about how we can enable positive and really vibrant startup communities. It really kind of ensures that we have to make sure we're all speaking about the same thing. So there's a number of kind of from the academic perspective, here's kind of one take on it. Eric Stam's view, lots of different elements in here that you can think of. Here's another one. It's very round and very colorful, but you can kind of see that it's identifying a number of different institutions, practices, norms, values, and there's an interaction between those. Here's another take here, technical skills, availability of capital. Capital is something we talk about a lot when we consider ecosystems, but what does that necessarily mean and how do we measure that? And as someone that comes from a kind of a quantitative perspective, I was very frustrated a lot of the times of seeing how people were measuring and coming up with how they weighed these different elements of an ecosystem, and really trying to kind of understand the underpinnings of how these different elements work together. Because ultimately, we have to make a lot of assumptions about how these sorts of ingredients work together. And I found a lot of those here, and it becomes difficult when you have to start measuring and comparing them. And as a comparative sociologist, it was really worrying to me when you see lots of things like this, often made by governments, that say, well, this means, so looking from this, it must mean, Sweden is better than Finland and better than Germany and the United Kingdom. But what these things mean they happen to miss a lot of the granular data of what's going on. So that's kind of how I approach my ethnographic research, and really kind of putting myself in the place of these entrepreneurs to try to understand what was happening between the lines. What are we missing by just using the kind of available quantitative data, and really understanding the mechanisms of how people work together, how people interact within these different communities, what's successful, and really what's the rest of the story. And that's really what I've been doing for the last couple of years, is trying to understand what are the social practices that entrepreneurs and people in their communities are performing, and how are some of the ways that the cities and regions where they live, how it's supporting those actions or how it's not supporting those actions. Because what you find, especially when we're taking maps or graphs like this that kind of count up number of elements or institutions, doesn't necessarily mean that people have access to those institutions. So there's a really popular measure that uses a lot kind of counting the number of accelerator programs, or counting the number of VCs or the amount of capital in a certain community. But if someone doesn't necessarily have access to that, how do we understand what type of opportunity is available in that community? And especially when you have things like this, where countries kind of want to see themselves go up the different rankings, it does make things really, it gives you some pause of, let's see what's going on underneath the lines. Because oftentimes, this is what people, especially policymakers, are looking for. How can we be more like this archetype? And this is something that we really have been moving away from in the last couple years, and trying to understand what is missing from models that find this as kind of the archetype of perfection, because this isn't replicable, and this is potentially quite damaging if we're moving towards something like this. So even though there's been a lot of work that has really supported the development of understanding what a new Silicon Valley would look like, what we've seen in the last couple years is that we are moving away from these sorts of understandings as being how we should move forward in developing unique and supportive ecosystem in wherever we may be. But these understandings still persist, and they're very enduring. This is just from last month. It's something that we see every conference or event that I go to. There's always some panel or proposal about how can we be the next Silicon Valley, or kind of putting this competition. And I think kind of if we're always thinking about how we can be something that we're not, we miss what actually makes us strong and what makes parts of our local community special and unique and valuable. So, and something that is the biggest part of this is the concept of an ecosystem is changing. So from this idea that all of your local institutions would be supporting local companies, this is no longer the case. And one of the biggest parts of this is the rise of remote working. So a lot of economic policies over the past decades have really tried to support the development of local talent, or to support the kind of importation of talent through different types of immigration policies. We've seen this in the Tech Nation policies over the last decades of let's bring in these bright, smart, talented people to help support our local community. Well, what we're finding is more and more people are hiring outside of the country where they reside, that they're no longer kind of wedded to this idea that your talent pool is just in your local community. And then you also have different types of institutions that are actually skewing where your company actually has the opportunity to be located. So some kind of unique trend that we've seen over the last kind of decade or so is that European companies often are locating themselves, their corporate entity, in the US, even though the physical entity is in Europe or in Asia. It's very easy to open a US headquartered company, and especially if you have global ambitions, starting a US headquartered company down the line, it could be very supportive and valuable for you if you're looking to raise US funding. So it's not about kind of like flying a flag or having this national aspect if you think that, strategically as a founder, it makes the most sense for my company to be on paper somewhere else. And you actually now have institutions such as the Stripe Atlas program, which makes this actually very easy to do. And some of the biggest companies in Europe that are all very proud of their national identity, you will find them in the Delaware Register of Companies. And they are not actually where Crunchbase or the different data aggregators says they are, but they are actually there. Something that's also very interesting is the Estonian e-residency program, which is they've kind of have a big push this week for British companies to move to Estonia. And this is something that I've been involved with as well, because I've worked with the government of Estonia supporting their Startup Estonia program and Estonia as a service for early stage founders or founders from anywhere to locate there. And it kind of just speaks to this point that how we understand an ecosystem, or how we understand where companies can be headquartered, that's changing. And it's about founders finding the best option for them, not necessarily having to be restricted where they live. And also this point of not all local tools are equally valuable. So we know that startup support for entrepreneurs of all sizes, no matter what ecosystem or what community you live in, is scarce. There is no community or environment for a company anywhere on this earth that has, you can talk to founders and say, I have everything that I need here. Perfect example is this gentleman who you might recognize as the most connected person in the world. Reid Hoffman of LinkedIn was building a little company that ended up being LinkedIn, and was trying to raise funding in his backyard of Silicon Valley, and was unsuccessful at doing that. Even though he had all the social capital and connections from being a Stanford graduate and coming out of PayPal, he still couldn't find an investment team to support his new venture. So he had to go to the outpost to Minnesota and raise from angel investors there. So this is something that's been going on for a long time. It's about expanding our idea of what an ecosystem is that something that is not confining founders to a certain geographic location or city or region. And something that I've also noticed in my work as looking at these social practices is that a lot of the times these digital tools are facilitating these types of social practices that we used to be doing in rooms like this. Ben has a student also working on some of these things that's kind of finding how these types of tools are helping founders from anywhere develop their social capital and make connections without having to rely on the resources of their local communities. And this is kind of a really unique thing, because oftentimes we have political agencies that try to manufacture all the different types of tools and support systems that will help founders grow and help businesses grow. But oftentimes it can be more valuable for them to be connected to this global ecosystem and this global community. So what does this look like in practice? Well, it kind of looks like this. This is my friend Paul. had a really nice tweet a couple months ago about how they got attention from a company investment firm that they never heard of just because of their online presence. Interesting, Paul is based down in Newcastle. And so you had Silicon Valley VCs kind of finding their company just because they were engaging on some of these different platforms and not having to rely on the local ecosystem resources. So really trying to expand your idea of what an ecosystem looks like is that it is not just something that's regionally or locally bound. It's something that we can take a more expansive view about. So I spoke earlier about not trying to replicate Silicon Valley, but every city and every location should be a fertile ground for entrepreneurship by taking advantage of these different conduits to be a part of this global ecosystem. Each city can be a very strong and great place to grow global companies, and there shouldn't be any reason not to do that. But if we look at it like this, and what I mentioned before with my research is that different cities are less well connected to this global network. So trying to find ways that as a local community and that we can connect more strongly to this global ecosystem. So I've just talked about how our understanding of the local ecosystem is something that has resources in a specific city or region. This is kind of eroding. But what is the role of the local in this new context? And what's really exciting about it is if we're no longer wedded to this idea that our local city or our local country, our country or our region has to provide all of these resources for our companies to grow into global powerhouses, then we can think about some of the social aspects that are preventing our community from growing and prospering. So really understanding what are some of the ways how we function as a community and as a society, how we can make this more successful. So looking at Edinburgh, for example, strong local communities can be this important place to build trust, support, and find solidarity in a business climate that is characterized by uncertainty and risk. So think about the types of companies that are coming up every day in this building. They're taking on different types of business models, industries, using technologies that didn't necessarily exist 5-10 years ago. They see a very uncertain future, but in spaces like this, they have the opportunity to connect with one another, to share their experiences, to kind of get feedback on what they're doing, and have this opportunity of, it's a very uncertain future for them, but they have this point of solidarity and this point of support, and it's facilitated by buildings like this, by places that entrepreneurs can come together. And what you see in a lot of these different communities that I've traveled to, especially in Europe, where it's very expensive for early stage founders, especially those pre-revenue, that don't have the opportunity to kind of work together or connect with one another. You see the erosion of local network ties and social capital. So the physical space to meet, to come together, and the ability to have access to that is really integral when we think about how we can connect to this global ecosystem. Because if everyone is connected to one another, then you have a better opportunity of being able to trade on those social ties. And this is something that is very challenging because you see often competing spaces, co-working spaces or venues that can create some challenges when it comes to building a very cohesive local community. So let's talk about what that looks like. Going back to this slide very quickly, if you've never started a company before, having a local community like this and a building like this with people that have used these tools, you'll get a lot farther faster. I've done interviews with hundreds of entrepreneurs at this point, especially those that are existing and operating outside local tech hubs. And they're finding out how to do the work they're doing by Googling. And it's a lot faster if you know someone that's been there before and you can have a connection to them. Something also worth mentioning is that local community serves as a lighthouse effect. It's a great marketing campaign for your city, region, if you have a vibrant startup scene and that people are actually building things that are coming there and finding connection. Different types of events also do a great job of showcasing some of the opportunities in the local startup scene. And if you look at kind of the rationales of migration of different founders, why they crossed borders, was for several years the director of the European Startup Initiative, which did a kind of global survey just on this, what was encouraging you to cross borders. And the number one reason, investment potential was one of them, but the other one was, I feel like there was a community, a place of solidarity or support. I feel like I could fit in and find that community in this new place. And I have a lot of really great examples of that. But also within, so kind of talking about that point earlier, that strong local communities serve as a bridge between these four kind of different types of skill sets. And we have a really great institution here at CodeBase called Creative Bridge, which is a really good example just of this. These are the four types of skills and people that work in a startup community. And you have the Creative Bridge is a great example of that, being one way that local communities can support people coming together and accruing this social capital that can be traded as currency. So everyone has a role to play in helping build these bridges and connect people within the local community. And something that I think when you're looking back at some of those very colorful graphs and slides that show the different measurements, you're thinking, well, I'm just one person, I'm just one founder, what can I do? But in this context, locally, everyone has a role to play into making their startup community as inclusive and as supportive as possible. So let's talk a little bit about what that looks like and some of the dangers that often crop up in startup communities that prevent them from reaching their fullest potential. So what are the things that lead to silo effects? What are the things that lead to people feeling excluded? And I'll show you some examples of that. The first one I think that's most important to talk about is exclusivity. And it looks like this. We're successful because of the people we keep out. So this is, all of these quotes actually come from things that I've heard operating in a specific startup ecosystem, namely this one. So think if you are someone that doesn't maybe look like the traditional tech person, and you hear someone talking about the ecosystem like this. How would you feel about coming in and participating? Probably not very good. You have to be on the guest list. So sometimes the best events, the best access to information is held behind a door that you might not ever find because you're not part of the in crowd. This is something that's very common and really holds different startup communities behind from reaching their highest potential. So tonight's event, I'm really proud that it's free, it's open access, it's widely publicized, and there's been such a demand for it. That kind of speaks to this point that making this information free and making venues free for people to meet can have such an important role. Insecurity. This is another kind of killer of the social capital within an ecosystem. And this is what it looks like when manifested. You know, social capital is something that only works if people feel comfortable to share their experiences, to help those in the next generation come along. But if someone doesn't feel safe in doing that for whatever reason, that's a big problem that we need to think about how we can combat as a local community. This is a case. So you had a serial founder wanted to do a talk about investment, and he came to me. He's like, I really would like to share my experience because it's been really a really negative one, and I don't want others to go through the same thing that I have, but I also don't want everyone to know about it. So this is something that was shared in confidence to me, but also speaks to the fact that there is something that people don't feel safe about. What about this one? It's from a founder was sharing with me about at an event. She didn't feel safe in that space. She didn't feel like she was comfortable because she didn't fit in. She didn't appear like the others, and she was made aware of that. So if we're talking about the social capital within a community, if people are having these sorts of experiences, there's more work to do to achieve kind of a more cohesive ecosystem. Here's another one. I'd like to start a meetup, but what if no one comes? I'm not important enough, basically. You know, as I mentioned at the start of this talk, initiation is one of the most important these social practices of a vibrant startup community. If people feel like they can take the initiative and put themselves out there, it's really hard for someone to start something. And we really have Ollie and Eduardo to thank for kind of getting this series started. But if others don't feel like they can do that, it says something about our local community that we all have a stake in, that we can fix and we can work on. I know I'm running out of time here, but very quickly, assumptions. This is some of these things that I've heard have really shocked me working here. Why would I ever go to X? No one there has ever built anything interesting. This is someone that asked me for a speaker for an event, and I suggested someone I thought was excellent. And this is kind of their response. No one is the measure of their previous position. No one is the measure of their geography of where they've been. And this is one of the mindset is one of the things that differentiates peripheral ecosystems, especially in Europe, from places like Silicon Valley or places like London, where you have a lot of newcomers. You don't necessarily know who might be the next Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or whatever success story you have. So you have to have the assumption that everyone could possibly be someone of value. And if you already approach people with the assumption that they're not valuable based on where they worked previously, it's a really damaging thing. So I worked for a lot of companies that maybe I wouldn't want to be associated with now, but I really hope people don't look at that experience as something that's a net negative. We have to approach everyone, especially if we're thinking globally, as someone that could potentially have value and keep the benefit of the doubt. And then this is one of the really worst kind of endemic things you see in different places, and Scotland's no exception. So I went out to lunch with the founder, and we had a really great conversation. I was really sharing a lot of experience and kind of making some connections for them. Really great team. And after the lunch, he asked how much he should pay for me to be sharing that advice with him. So, and it comes from an experience that's kind of boiled into the community here in some parts that, it's pay to play, that information is not free. And this is one of the reasons why Brad Feld and the founder group have really kind of advocated for different types of these social norms, and one of those is give first. So the same with not having assumptions about the value of someone. It's also to kind of not look at our interactions within the community as transactional. That, maybe that person could be valuable to you down the line, but maybe we're just doing this because we're being a nice person. And that was really shocking to see. And the final one is survivorship bias. So when you're developing a community and trying to build a strong, vibrant community, you can't rest on your laurels, that nothing is unfinished. And you need to keep always, every single day, working to make as successful community as possible. You can't just accept that, things are already going well when you don't necessarily know what potential you could have. So I'm just going to leave that there. We have a really exciting panel coming up with some really great speakers that have come. And so I really look forward to you sharing your questions, comments, concerns, and see how we can make this place the most exciting and supportive community possible. So thank you.